We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Secret flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery, which takes off on Wednesday. It'll put the United States Air Force spy satellite into space. It's so secret that even the exact launch time is being kept quiet. Lawrence McGinty of ITN's Channel 4 News reports.
These snatched pictures of the astronauts on the shuttle's next mission are just about all we'll see of them, because for the first time ever, the shuttle flight is wholly under military control, and the military says no publicity. Why? Because they want to keep the wraps on the satellite the shuttle is carrying into space. ITN sources say the secret satellite looks like this. It weighs 2 tons. Its purpose is to eavesdrop on Russian radio communications. Experts say it could be the first of a new series of spy satellites codenamed Aqua-Cade. America's radio listening post in Iran no longer operates since Ayatollah Khomeini's rise to power. Instead, the new satellite from its position over the equator will be able to monitor radio communications along the Iran-Iraq border and in Afghanistan, as well as monitoring radio signals between test missiles and the Soviet Space Center in Tyura-Tam. Russia also has an active spy satellite program. Last September, a powerful Proton rocket, seen here for the first time on TV, launching Russia's probe to Halley's Comet, launched Russia's biggest ever electronic spy in the sky.
Defense, in its proper context, requires a very, very explicit awareness of what your potential adversary is up to. And I think because most wars in this century have started because of misperception or lack of intelligence, I think it's no bad thing that we do look over the hedge and over the fence with precision and with accuracy about what is going on respective sides. And it works with the Soviets as well.
The United States Space Shuttle Discovery lifted off little more than an hour ago from Cape Canaveral on a top-secret spy mission. The authorities have maintained strict security over all aspects of the flight, and even the launch time was kept secret until just a few minutes before the rocket's departure. Brian Barron has just sent us this report.
As shuttle launches go, this was the ultimate cliffhanger, with NASA giving nothing away until the final minutes. The only glimpse of the 5-man crew, headed by Navy Captain Thomas Mattingly, was on their way to the launch pad 2 hours before Discovery set off. Because of the secret military cargo in the Discovery's hold, the Pentagon insisted on minimum publicity. But the launch, when it came in mid-afternoon Florida time, was presented with NASA's usual mastery of science and showmanship.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1... ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery, the first flight totally dedicated to Department of Defense mission. And it's cleared the tower.
Unlike all previous shuttle flights, NASA, on the Pentagon's orders, blacked out communications between ground control and the Discovery's crew, so the media couldn't listen in. During the launch, the Space Center here was closed to the public, but hundreds of NASA employees stopped work to watch. No details have been given of the shuttle's orbit, or when it will launch the powerful spy satellite it's believed to be carrying. As depicted here, this new kind of satellite is designed to intercept Soviet communications, then beam the information back to an American monitoring base in Australia. From there, it will be sent by another satellite to the Washington headquarters of the National Security Agency for attempted deciphering. So Discovery's military mission off to a good start. Already, no less than 1/5 of the next 70 shuttle missions have been booked by the Pentagon. And in California, the Air Force is completing its very own shuttle launching pad. So today's launch represents a new kind of American manned space effort. Despite the Pentagon's restrictions, NASA was allowed to show pictures of the shuttle on the brink of space taken by chase planes. but no one's saying how long Discovery's mission will last.
Will remain in geosynchronous orbit above the western part of the Soviet Union. This first ever exclusively military mission comes almost 25 years after Kennedy launched the drive to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other.
Kennedy publicly pledged to develop space for the benefit of mankind. In those days, NASA basked in the publicly viewed endeavor. Even the failures were revealed, and the deaths upon the launch pad were admitted and mourned. Today's very public secret launch would never have been necessary had this genuinely secret launch pad at Vandenberg, California, been ready. But 2 years behind schedule and £700 million over budget, there are problems. When it is finished, NASA's embarrassingly public Florida facility will become superfluous. There, the residue from today's launch still hung in the air as NASA made the last public pronouncement on today's thrust. From now on, no pictures, no sound until it returns. But military officials admit that this launch, the first of 16, will enable the US eventually to deploy the paraphernalia for President Reagan's Star Wars defense scheme. 10 years ago, the Russians and the Americans joined together briefly to unite their efforts to develop space. Today, secrecy from each other is the essence. Back in 1975, Russian hands grasped American hands in space in one of the most dramatic handshakes in history. Today, Soyuz and Apollo hang still linked together in Washington's Space Museum, a far cry from the gathering secrecy that shrouds developments in space today. Scientists here in Washington believe that the launching of the secret shuttle will make it all the harder to monitor or quantify the risks of war in space. John Snow, News at 10, Washington.
Mrs. Thatcher's Asian tour, Neil Kinnock, says she's bashing Britain. The death of an AIDS baby, no need for alarm, say the health department. American teenagers trying to shake the drug habit. The house that burned down as firemen stood and watched. Discovery finally blasted off from Cape Canaveral in Florida today, 2 months late. The crew, 6 men and a woman, will launch 2 satellites and carry out various scientific experiments. But the choice of astronaut has come in for a lot of criticism. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
The space shuttle has a controversial passenger on board. Not an astronaut, but a senator, Jake Garn. It's no coincidence he's chairman of the body which oversees NASA's spending. A former pilot, he's had just 120 hours training for this mission. The launch was delayed an hour by bad weather, but eventually the senator and his 6 colleagues were on their way.
2, 1. We have SRB ignition and liftoff.
NASA is riding out criticisms of the senator's flight. It's got enough on its plate trying to get this year's schedule of shuttle flights back on course. There should have been 10 flights this year. One was cancelled when a satellite on board went wrong just before launch. And today's flight was delayed when Discovery had 2 holes punched in it some weeks ago. A large bucket fell on it from a crane. To make matters worse for NASA, Europe's Ariane rocket has become a serious threat to the shuttle's viability as a commercial launch vehicle. Only today, Ariane was signed up to launch 2 communication satellites for Germany. Ariane offered a cheaper launch than the shuttle. The cost of a shuttle launch was due to nearly double.
His selection for the flight has caused some resentment. Today's launch from Cape Canaveral came on the 4th anniversary of the first shuttle flight. It's also 24 years to the day since Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union became the first man in space when he achieved a single orbit in the spacecraft Vostok 1.
And liftoff.
Today's launch of the shuttle Discovery is the first since the secret military mission in January and the first regular shuttle this year, after a series of delays and hitches caused the mission to be postponed half a dozen times. Among today's crew, here posing for the pre-flight pictures, one man who's making history and not a little controversy. He's payload specialist Jake Garn, aged 52 and a most unusual astronaut. Before becoming a spaceman, he was better known for his other job.
Banking committee will come to order.
Senator Jake Garn of Utah just happens to be the chairman of the committee that signs the checks that keeps NASA in business. It's not that the senator is freeloading, he'll be carrying out medical experiments while on board. Monitors will measure his head, stomach and chest movements, microphones will record his tummy rumblings, tape measures around his feet and ankles will monitor fluid loss. And he'll be able to turn the sort of cartwheels that earthbound politicians can only dream of. So why the controversy? Well, apart from one specialist engineer, the senator is the first civilian in space. And that's annoyed the nation's teachers, who heard their president in the heat of an election campaign promise that role to one of them.
I'm not a private citizen. I'm chairman of NASA's Appropriations Subcommittee.
NASA clearly hope he'll be impressed. In these hard economic times, they need his support. His trip is costed at $80,000.
And is now virtually useless. Discovery was launched yesterday after months of delays. For a while, the mission went smoothly. A Canadian satellite was successfully placed.
Carry out a daring rescue operation in space. One of the satellites they launched at the weekend has gone into the wrong orbit. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnell, has the details.
LISAT, as this satellite is called, was intended to provide quick communications for America's sailors, soldiers and airmen, wherever they may be. But it's got stuck, floating around only 80 kilometres from Discovery. With 5 tons of unused and explosive fuel aboard, there's no question of bringing this one back to Earth. So at Mission Control, they're planning a safe way for the astronauts to get it started again, so it'll fire itself into the right orbit. The problem is a stuck switch, and somehow the astronauts have got to flick it over. Mission Control has devised what they call a fly swatter, and tomorrow the astronauts will probably make a spacewalk and fix it to the end of the robot arm. Then Discovery will start moving alongside the stranded satellite. Because this is the most dangerous thing the shuttle's ever done, all the astronauts must be inside when they try to flick the switch with the robot arm, probably on Wednesday.
To tackle a fault that's kept a £60 million satellite in the wrong orbit. The shuttle would first manoeuvre up to the satellite, which is spinning twice every minute. Ground tests have shown it would be too dangerous to use a spacewalking astronaut, so in a water tank simulating weightlessness, they've been trying out ways of fully releasing a lever which will switch on the satellite's electrical systems. They think the answer is to attach a piece of plastic which looks like a fly swatter to the shuttle's robot arm and brush it against the satellite, as NASA puts it, rather like grabbing the brass ring from a merry-go-round. At Mount Vesuvius in southern Italy, an American sailor was rescued from the dormant volcano after
an electrical system and booster rocket.
Though launching the satellite last Saturday went perfectly, the rocket that would then have blasted it into the correct position never fired. As astronauts on the ground have shown, there's a small lever on the side which, if tweaked, should fire the rocket. But as it spins on uselessly above Earth, there's another problem. If an astronaut were to spacewalk out of the shuttle and try to start it manually, the rocket should not then fire for 45 minutes. But as it failed the first time, it might fire instantly, threatening the life of the spacewalker. So on the ground with a mock satellite, NASA has been testing other possibilities, and from materials lying around on board the shuttle, have devised a sort of fly swat that would be fixed onto the robot arm and, in the words of the flight director,
and then as the little lever comes around, it'll get caught in one of these devices, one of these holes.
£85 million worth of satellite might then be saved by a cut-out tuppenny plastic cover from a flight manual. Whilst the first senator in space illustrates the effects of weightlessness on paper darts and toy jumping mice, this rescue is fraught with difficulty and some danger. Unlike their successful predecessors, this mission has not been trained to rescue satellites, and the tools with which they must now do it are totally makeshift. Listen to NASA's list.
Flight data file, plastic covers, a Swiss Army knife, gray and silver tape, a swizzle stick, scissors, a bone saw, and a vacuum cleaner.
Jon Snow, News at 10, Washington.
Here, the government's bill scrapping the GLC and the Metropolitan Councils is coming in for some serious criticism on the opening day of its passage through the Lords.
Hello again. Astronauts on the American space shuttle Discovery have been on an unexpected spacewalk this afternoon. It's the first part of a daring plan to rescue a stranded communications satellite, which went wrong after it was launched from Discovery on Saturday. Today, 2 members of the crew had to leave the shuttle to fix special homemade devices onto the robot arm. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has the details.
And these pictures of the spacewalk have just come in. Mission Control say the 2 astronauts, David Griggs and Jeffrey Hoffman, have only managed to fix 2 out of 3 homemade tools onto Discovery's robot arm. But that, they think, should be enough. Now the astronauts are getting back inside Discovery, and a very tired crew will take a night's rest. Then the risky attempt to switch on the stranded satellite can be made tomorrow. The astronauts have made their emergency tools from anything they could find on board, even the toilet curtain. And earlier they checked with Mission Control to make sure the fly swatter was right.
Plastic covers, a Swiss Army knife, gray and silver tape, a swizzle stick.
Tomorrow there'll be just 7 minutes for the robot arm and its fly swatters to switch on the satellite, and it'll be Ray Seddon's job to operate it. And the other crew members, with 2 extra days in space, are using toys to make an educational film about weightlessness. Senator Gahn says that flying weightless paper aeroplanes is much more fun than politics. Clockwork mice work better in space, but when it comes to using a bat, it's a completely different ballgame.
In space to try to salvage a satellite which didn't work properly when it was put into orbit. They've attached a device to the robot arm of the shuttle which will be used to pivot a switch on the malfunctioning satellite. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson explains.
The spacewalk into the payload bay lasted just 3 hours. Astronauts Jeff Hoffman and David Griggs attached 2 so-called fly swats to the end of the remote-controlled arm. The spacewalk was unplanned, but a necessary first stage in trying to get the dead satellite working again.
I think you're asking where's the end of the wire with respect to the fly swatter. Is that correct?
That's affirmed. The second fly swatter, the one that the wire on is attached to.
The fly swats are makeshift affairs, plastic book covers with holes cut in them, taped onto pieces of hose pipe. Tomorrow morning, the space shuttle will catch up with the satellite, now 40 miles ahead, and move in close. In a maneuver devised and practiced by colleagues on Earth in the last day or so, the fly swats will brush against the side of the slowly spinning satellite, hopefully to trip a switch. This should activate the satellite. If it's successful, the shuttle then has about 50 minutes to get clear before the satellite automatically blasts off into a much higher orbit. If all goes well, NASA will claim it as further proof of the importance of having men in space to make running repairs to expensive hardware. But the problems are unlikely to give confidence to companies wanting to launch satellites or those asked to insure them.
The American shuttle astronauts are safely back in Discovery after their unplanned spacewalk to try and save a disabled communications satellite. They managed to attach makeshift plastic fly swats to the shuttle's robot arm, which will be used to set off the satellite's own electrical system.
A tranquil awakening high above Earth before an arduous day. Inside the shuttle cabin, the makeshift fly swap that it's hoped might ensnare the rogue satellite switch.
Is that more or less what you had in mind?
The camera at the elbow of the shuttle's robot arm above the cargo bay trained on the closed cockpit door as the astronauts prepared for what had never been planned, spacewalking. Plenty of weightless space performances have gone before, but always with intricate training and preparation. Messrs. Hoffman and Griggs had only been through general training on Earth, never intending to leave the shuttle in space. Now, with their bulky gloves, they wrestled with the makeshift fly swats, cut from the plastic covers of a flight manual. They attached 3 varieties of the swatter to the end of the robot arm. Tomorrow, Discovery will fly close to the tumbling dormant satellite in an attempt to brush the ignition switch with the fly swat and so trigger £80 million worth of hardware into life. But that, if anything, will be more hazardous than today's unplanned spacewalking. Discovery's navigational computer was never programmed to make such a maneuver. It will depend on pilot skill and the skill of the one woman astronaut aboard who will have to drive the robot arm.
Have a good lunch, you guys. And you guys did super for the EVA.
To the evident relief of mission control on the ground, the astronauts are now safely back aboard, the satellite still tumbling 50 miles ahead of them. John Snow, News at 10, Washington.
Mrs. Thatcher and Labour's leader Mr. Kinnock had a dust-up in the car.
Astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery are making the final preparations before attempting to rescue another satellite, which has malfunctioned and is drifting powerlessly. The satellite, known as SYNCOM, which was to be leased by the US Defense Department, failed to fire guidance rockets last Saturday, when it was put into orbit by the Discovery. If the rescue attempt fails tomorrow, the $35 million satellite will be lost forever. And the salvage operation is looking increasingly difficult tonight as details emerge of just what problems the astronauts are up against. The first stage of the rescue began today with an unplanned spacewalk in Discovery's cargo bay. Astronauts Jeffrey Hoffman and David Griggs spent 3 hours attaching so-called fly swatters to the end of the shuttle's remote-controlled arm.
Step number 1.
The fly swatters don't owe much to high-space technology. Plastic book covers were cut out and then taped to pieces of hose pipe. Tomorrow morning, the shuttle will catch up with the satellite, which is now 40 miles ahead, and in a maneuver practiced on Earth in the last few days, the shuttle crew will try to brush the fly swatters against the slow-moving satellite, using the mechanical arm to trip a switch, which should then activate the satellite into its proper orbit. The satellite is the first to be designed especially for shuttle launches, and its failure has no doubt further rocked confidence in the shuttle's reliability. NASA can't afford many mistakes with such high stakes riding on the satellite launching business. One estimate puts the business at a figure of $300 billion over the next 2 decades. 16 satellites have been launched in as many shuttle flights, 2 of which failed completely last year and had to be rescued and brought back to Earth. The year before, another satellite malfunctioned and ground control were considered very lucky to be able to nudge it into its correct orbit. Meanwhile, the shuttle's rival, the Ariane rocket program, is doing increasingly well. It's had 2 failures in 12 flights, but they occurred during early tests before the rocket was used for commercial purposes. Now, David Whitehouse, how dangerous is this rescue operation going to be?
I don't think it's at all dangerous for the crew. One of the reasons why they're trying to do it this way is because they ruled out any possibility of an astronaut actually going out and trying to trip the lever manually. That would be quite dangerous. I think since they're doing it with the robot arm, it is going to be very much more difficult than dangerous. The crew aren't in any imminent danger from the satellite.
The thing couldn't blow up?
It seems very unlikely that that would happen. They're not exactly sure exactly what has gone wrong with the satellite. It seems that this lever has failed to trip and start the procedure for switching on the satellite and for boosting it into its higher orbit. But they're not absolutely certain about what exactly has gone wrong with this satellite.
And the other fear, well, wasn't it, that the guidance rockets, when they fire on the satellite, could in some way dish the shuttle? No, that's not a problem.
That's not a problem. They think that they will have the full 45 minutes after they trip the switch in order to get the shuttle away.
Now, how difficult is the operation going to be with all this extraordinary makeshift equipment we've heard about?
Well, actually, it is going to be quite a tricky task. The problem is that since the satellite has been launched on Saturday, it's been growing steadily cooler, and the propellant inside has been starting to freeze. It may already have started to freeze. And this freezing of the propellant is the reason why they can't send a shuttle flight up in the future in a couple of months and try the same procedure with specially designed tools.
So this is the only chance?
This is the only chance. It may already have happened that the fuel starts to freeze, and when the rocket does fire, it may misfire and even now send the satellite into the wrong orbit.
But what about the difficulties? I mean, why, for example, haven't they got real tools? I mean, using these fly swats is extraordinary, isn't it?
It is certainly extraordinary that with such space-age technology and with the enormous cost of these satellites that they're resorting to cutting up ring binders. I think that the thing is that this is the third of the satellites in this range that they have launched, and the other 2 went off absolutely flawlessly, and they had no reason to expect that this lever would not trip. And these satellites are enormously complex objects, and that one could think of an almost infinite number of things which can go wrong with them, and to take a specific tool for each one of these would be impractical.
If this operation fails, what is the message then, do you think, for the shuttle program? How much of a crisis is it in?
Well, I think they have 2 crises. One is that they are having problems in transferring satellites from the shuttle into high orbit where communication satellites have to be parked. And this compounded with the fact that the shuttle launch timetable is in a mess at the moment, and they've been having great problems in getting the shuttle into space at all regularly. I think that will give the impetus to the Ariane rocket as being the major option for launching communication satellites. The shuttle is a marvellous aerospace vehicle. It demonstrates that man can work in space superbly. However, as a satellite launcher, it may not be as efficient as a simple, straightforward, low-technology rocket.
David Whitehouse, thank you very much indeed. Well, we'll see what happens with that story tomorrow. Quick look at the headlines in tomorrow morning's papers, and of course the story about Prince and Princess Michael of Kent dominates the headlines. The Daily Mirror has what it calls another world exclusive on the front page. It's a picture of the wedding back in 1978 of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, and right behind...
The camera on the arm shows the solar panels of the satellite spinning slowly as the fly swaths are moved forward to brush against them. As the switch came round, the first time, the fly swat caught and nudged it.
Broke a rung on
The second time round, it happened again. Here, in slow motion, the swat is caught by the protruding switch. The swat itself is ripped by the force of the switch. The shuttle backed away and waited for the satellite's aerial to extend, showing it had been activated. It didn't happen. NASA believes it probably isn't the switch after all that's causing the problem, and they've abandoned attempts to save the satellite. Last time NASA had problems deploying satellites, they managed to retrieve them and bring them back to Earth. The Palliper and Westar satellites, rescued last November, are now being refurbished, ready to be launched again. NASA will have to consider eventually whether to mount a rescue for today's dead satellite, all $80 million worth of it. It's full of fuel, though, and could be dangerous. But they'll have plenty of time to think about it. This satellite isn't going anywhere. The loss of the satellite will damage confidence in the shuttle as a commercial launch vehicle, and will help Europe in its efforts to sell launches on its rocket, Ariane.
The decision by the new have failed in their attempt to start up a defective satellite. The failure could cost the insurance market, Lloyd's of London, millions of pounds, and puts, some believe, a question mark over the future of the whole shuttle programme. The electrical power supply of the SYNCOM communications satellite failed to start when it was launched from Discovery on Saturday. Today, the astronauts tried to turn the power on using a homemade fly swatter device connected to the shuttle's robot arm. They twice made contact with a switch on the crippled satellite, but it wouldn't start. John Snow in Washington has been monitoring the mission.
Early this morning, Commander Bobko piloted the shuttle the 50 miles into range of the rogue satellite, now spinning at 2 revolutions every minute, uselessly ahead of him. The robot arm was extended out of the shuttle cargo bay, the fly swat device sticking out like fingers at the end. In the shuttle cabin, Dr. Ray Seddon, the one woman aboard, stood at the controls of the robot arm. The satellite was by now a risky 30 feet from the shuttle. Finally, Dr. Seddon brushed the fly swat tantalizingly against the reflective solar panels on the satellite. Here comes the switch that Hughes Aircraft, the satellite's manufacturers, said would trigger the satellite into life. Next time round, the SWAT tweaks it decisively.
Broke a rung on the fly swatter.
Twice they did it in one of the most precise collisions ever engineered in space, with feverish effort over 3 days by hundreds of technicians on the ground, and the 7 in space, they've done it.
We estimate we got a hard physical contact on at least 2 occasions.
And we concur with that. That was a great job.
But the satellite did not respond. No antennae sprouted, no rocket fired, and to avoid further risk, further efforts were abandoned. On the ground, after the gigantic effort concentrated on that one switch, the admission that the switch was almost certainly on all the time, and never the problem to begin with.
Going into today, we were operating on the assumption that the lever was the problem. Obviously, it's not.
I could not personally see whether the lever had any further motion or not, but it was hit hard enough by the fly swatter that it lays to rest the issue about whether the lever was working properly. It was open and it was hit by the fly swat.
So as far as the task we had to do, I think we did an outstanding job, but it's unfortunate that the task that we did, which was the only task we could do with this particular spacecraft, didn't accomplish the end result we had all hoped for.
For Hughes Aircraft, this is the 3rd satellite to fail from a shuttle launch. What's going wrong?
I can assure you I am even more interested in the cause of failure than you are.
The Hughes satellite is now junk. Rescue only a remote possibility. The failure coupled with the extraordinary feat in ever tweaking the switch, wounding to what is the pride of America, technical wizardry in space. Some observers here seeing the brilliance and pathos of high technology coupled with a brilliantly manipulated homemade fly swat, coupled again with the disappointment of eventual loss, as somehow especially American. John Snow, ITN, Washington.
The current problem with the shuttle is only the latest in a number of hitches which are now casting serious doubt over the future of commercial missions for Discovery. Last November, the crew of the shuttle achieved a historic first when they managed to rescue 2 communications satellites which had gone into a defective orbit 220 miles above the Earth. Both satellites were retrieved by astronauts using jet backpacks to maneuver in space and were taken back to Earth on the shuttle to be repaired. The rescue mission alone cost insurers £11 million on top of the £180 million paid out when the satellites failed initially. But although the 2 satellites have now been repaired, no buyer has been found for them, and the insurance companies, including Lloyd's of London, are still waiting to get some of their money back. And the problems aren't confined to the American space shuttle. Next week's mission of the European equivalent, the Ariane rocket, has been postponed because of a suspect computer on board. So what's the cost of these sort of failures, particularly for the insurance companies involved? Over the last 5 years, satellite insurance has cost the insurance companies more than £400 million. Lloyd's of London, who have around 60% of the business, have been hit particularly hard. This latest satellite failure is estimated to cost the insurers another £80 million. So what's been going wrong? With me now is Dr. David Baker from Space Consultants International. As we heard before, Dr. Baker, NASA couldn't tell us what's going wrong. But surely we can't blame the carrier for the maverick behaviour of the cargo it's asked to put in space.
Well, that's very true, and I think one of the fundamental problems in perception is the fact that hitherto we have had a whole series of launch vehicles, 3 or 4 or 5, among which the problems have been spread. Today we have one primary American launch system, although the expendables are still trucking on launching satellites, 1 or 2 or 3 a year, but most of the traffic is going on shuttle, and so the perception is seen that it's a shuttle-originated problem, when in fact it's spread throughout the whole satellite industry.
So has shuttle got a PR problem or something more fundamental?
I think by default it has a PR problem. It is certainly doing exceptionally well on specification and on performance, what it was designed to do. It's filling a role that's completely new. This really isn't a fully operational vehicle yet. It's first of a kind. It's like asking the Wright brothers flyer to take jumbo routes across the Atlantic, and it's being strained because of that additional task it's being required to perform.
Now, given that's their problem, one of perception almost, is it going to help them or hinder them to have a senator who's been responsible for signing some of their checks on board?
Well, I think it's a good thing that the Senator has an opportunity, who is in charge of the Senate Space Committee, to look at the kind of flexibility that's built into manned spaceflight operations. The shuttle is only half the story. The space station will be with us in 10 years' time. That's the only sensible vehicle that can service that kind of facility. The President has seen on the ground, in his role as head of the Senate Committee, how NASA from Apollo 13 in 1971, in that historic rescue of 3 potentially doomed astronauts around the moon, on through the recovery late last year of the 2 failed satellites in orbit, that there has indeed been consistent and high credible success in recovery. This time it didn't work. It can't always.
But the concept of the shuttle has had its critics right down since the first one 16 ago.
Right.
Is there any possibility, given the massive military interest in the shuttle and the whole sort of Star Wars thing, which is highly dependent on that sort of system being able to get up and deliver, is there any possibility that the shuttle could be doomed as a concept?
I don't think so. Certainly it's proving itself as a concept, and its concept is to be a reusable, manned, satellite servicing vehicle. It doesn't have all the tools necessary to accomplish that right now, and consequently the big expansion of commercial interests in space activities is almost overwhelming the requirements on the technicians and the engineers. It's a management problem almost of the same proportions as Apollo represented in its magnitude in the 1960s.
Dr. Baker, thank you very much.
Astronauts aboard the American space shuttle Discovery have failed in their attempt to switch on a communications satellite they launched 5 days ago. They used a plastic attachment like a fly swat on a robot arm to catch the satellite's power switch, but they couldn't start the rocket motor.
With the shuttle's robot arm extended out against a backdrop of the Earth's surface far below, Discovery closed on the rogue satellite early this morning, eventually riding a risky 30 feet from it. Inside the shuttle cabin, the one-woman astronaut aboard, Dr. Ray Seddon, maneuvered the joystick that controls the robot arm, dangling the homemade fly swat off the end of the arm, brushing it tantalizingly against the reflecting solar panels on the satellite's surface. Here comes the switch that would theoretically trigger the satellite into life. Next time round, the SWAT tweaks the switch decisively.
Broke a rung on the fly swatter.
Twice they did it in two of the most precise collisions ever engineered in space. With feverish effort over 3 days by hundreds of technicians on the ground and the 7 in space, they'd done it.
We estimate we got a hard physical contact on at least 2 occasions.
And we concur with that. That was a great job.
But the satellite did not respond. No antennae sprouted, no rocket fired. On the ground, NASA's elation was heavily tinged with disappointment.
But it's unfortunate that the tasks that we did, which was the only task we could do with this particular spacecraft, didn't accomplish the end result we had all hoped for.
The satellite, now twisting, abandoned 80 million pounds worth of space debris consigned to outer darkness. The shuttle backing away for safety, the robot arm still extended, the spent fingers of the fly swat rescue attempt hanging limply. Despite the success of the human and technological feat in ever triggering that switch, the shuttle's reputation for flawless satellite launches unenhanced. The astronauts, for now, concerned about the battered state of those fly swats.
Well, not to worry, Don. We don't think we're going to try it again this mission.
John Snow, News at 10, Washington.
Here, the CBI, the employers, called on the government today for an immediate cut of 1% in interest rates. The Bank of England has been accused of helping to block such a cut this week. Encouraging the CBI's demand, the pound was up again today against the dollar, the Deutschmark and the Japanese yen. The pound closed against the dollar at $1.27.5, up 0.2 cents on the day. That's despite American industrial production up
crew on the Space Shuttle Discovery after their attempt to fix the communication satellite which failed to go into the correct orbit. And never want to miss a chance, he did a little lobbying for votes at the same time.
Discovery was floating 200 miles above Africa this morning when the telephone rang.
Commander Bob Cole. Good morning, Mr. President.
Although they hadn't managed to get the satellite working, the president told them America was proud of them.
Listen, we know you had some frustrations up there, but overall I think we can all be proud. We saw a lot of human ingenuity at work, making the fly swatter-like tool. We had to acknowledge that was great work, and we're calling all of you up there now the SWAT team.
Presidential space calls are usually non-political, but with his earthly support looking shaky, Mr. Reagan couldn't resist some long-distance lobbying of the senator astronaut.
You're doing a fine job up there, but I could use your help down here right now in getting the federal budget under control and arranging assistance for some people fighting for their freedom in Central America, so don't stay up there too long. I'm well aware of the vote on the Nicaraguan aid on Tuesday night, and I'll be voting just the way you'd like me to when I get back. Well, God bless you.
One more vote then for the president, and the best news he's heard from space today.
This afternoon. And like everything else on this week-long mission, nothing quite went according to plan. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
Bad weather at the Kennedy Space Center delayed the homecoming an hour and a half. They had to go round the world again before coming into land. It had been one of the less successful missions. Only one satellite successfully launched, a second stranded in the wrong orbit, and obstinately staying there, despite ingenious attempts to switch it on. The space officials at the Kennedy Space Center have little time to contemplate this week's problems. They've got their work cut out to launch the next shuttle, Challenger, in just 10 days' time. That will carry the manned laboratory SPACELAB into orbit, packed with scientific experiments.
Touchdown.
Today's landing was uneventful. Well, almost.
Mission Control, Houston, it looks like Discovery just blew a tire.
The astronauts were disappointed the mission didn't go better. Unusually, they said nothing to the press when they finally emerged.
An inquest jury at Penzance has decided that the death of a former serviceman from a rare lung cancer 16 months ago was not connected with his presence at Britain's first nuclear bomb tests in the 1950s. They decided that Kenneth Measures died.
Outstanding. 2 for 2.
But the satellite failed to start spinning and move to a higher orbit.
Yes, sir. The Omni is still down and we're trying to watch the spinner.
This is Mission Control Houston. Following the deployment of the CENTCOM, the crew reported they have not seen the deployment of the Omni antenna. They're now awaiting some indication of the spin-up of the CENTCOM satellite. It's supposed to spin up to 33 RPM.
At the Johnson Space Center in Houston, NASA worked out how to fix the satellite on a mock-up. They worked underwater to simulate weightlessness. It seemed all that was needed was for a switch to be pulled to get it started, but it wasn't possible for the astronauts to do it. So a device like a fly swat was designed to pull the switch. The fly swat then had to be duplicated in space.
Is that more or less what you had in mind for the number 1 flight swatter?
Roger, Ray, that looks good to me.
Having made their fly swats, the astronauts had to install them.
Discovery crossing over Baja, California at the present time.
And we'll pull them apart a couple inches, and I don't think there'll be any problem holding together. Hey, this went on easily enough.
Discovery Houston, com check.
The fly swats were made out of spare bits of plastic and tape lying around the shuttle.
Fly swatter and lacrosse stick onto the end effector handrail.
The swats then had to be fitted to the shuttle's robot arm with tape.
I think you're asking where's the end of the wire with respect to the fly swatter. Is that correct?
That's affirmed. The second fly swatter, the one that the wire on is attached to.
Okay, that's a lacrosse stick.
Looks like I just did a super job there.
Turn around and take a bow for the elbow.
Okay.
Arm moving in again now for another attempt. Broke a rung on the fly swatter.
But despite all the hard work, the satellite still couldn't be made to function. Worth £40 million, it'll have to wait for a future shuttle rescue mission.
Just move translationally. The paddle ball behaves quite a lot like it does in 1G, except when you let go. Here's the coming up, probably the only time it'll ever be demonstrated shooting the moon at 2,500 feet per second. See how beautifully and easily it flies? Hard to get things positioned correctly. feet.
Then into a perfect landing.
65 feet.
Well, nearly perfect.
Feet. 45. Gear down in lock. Touchdown. Nose gear descending now. Touchdown. Mission Control Houston, it looks like Discovery just blew a tire.
On BBC One now, the search continues to find this year's mastermind, whilst here on 2.
Relief supplies for Africa. She was seen off by the singer Bob Geldof, who inspired the Band-Aid project. Band-Aid 1 was loaded with grain, flour, medical supplies and equipment. The ship's been chartered for 6 months at a cost of £1 million. She's expected to
this year. They've promised to pay shipping costs for all aid sent to the drought-stricken areas in Ethiopia. That's if, in turn, the charities sending the aid spend the money they've saved on further food supplies to the victims of famine. The first of Band-Aid ships left today.
Altogether, 9 different charitable organisations shipped with Band-Aid today, saving themselves £100,000 in freight charges. milk powder and beans from the Little Way Association. A water tanker from Mole Valley farmers, several thousand tons of supplies, including Band-Aid's own contributions. The ship, chartered from Germany, paint still wet when she sailed tonight. It's not just pop stars who are backing Band-Aid. King Fahad of Saudi Arabia is paying for most of the fuel, and President Mubarak of Egypt says he'll speed things up through the Suez. But just how big can Band-Aid get?
It doesn't interest me the hugeness of it. That only interests me in that we're more capable of keeping people alive. So long as that continues, then all the more power to it, you know. I mean, this is tangible evidence that, I mean, a good portion of the world bought this boat, you know, and they obviously care enough.
Loading completed, Band-Aid 1 was hurriedly christened, then set course for the Red Sea, her passage smoothed by unprecedented...
Flowers and champagne for the Israeli homecoming. The Prince and Princess of Wales have a private audience with the Pope. And manna from heaven, reliving a wartime airlift. Good evening. The government has ordered a major health service shake-up to improve the system of screening women for cervical cancer. It follows the death of an Oxford woman who had not been told her cancer test was positive. Health Minister Kenneth Clarke today announced a 4-point plan. A nationwide computer system to recall women for the results of their tests, more tests for older women, better laboratory facilities, and a new system ensuring every woman who has a test can get her results.
The new orders compelling all health authorities to install a computerised system for the cervical tests will help dispel criticism that the screening programme has failed to save the lives of some women. The initiative follows the much publicised case of an Oxford woman who died after not being told that a test for cervical cancer proved positive. The Health Minister says that a new system for screening breast cancer will come next. It's hoped the new guidelines will relieve some of the anxiety felt amongst women. And the Minister wants GPs to become more closely involved.
I'm going to be discussing this with the medical profession, and if they think they can handle that and want to take it on, then that would be a perfectly adequate way of doing it. But I think it requires the doctor and the patient to behave sensibly. The trouble comes when the patient has no means of knowing what she's meant to do, or she doesn't even know that the results have been received by her doctor. And I think most women, when they're notified, will take the obvious next step, which is to make sure their doctor knows what he's doing and to ask the doctor what she should now do about it.
A computerised system of records, like one used at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, will, say the government, reduce the risks and avoid a repetition of the Oxford tragedy.
The Israelis have pulled out of Tyre in southern Lebanon, leaving behind an upsurge in the civil war that's forced more than 70,000 Christians to flee from their homes. Israel says it won't intervene in the new fighting. The Christian refugees have fled to Jezin. Today, Muslim militias stopped short of the city, but the latest Israeli withdrawal means that safe territory for the Christians is getting further and further away.
3 years ago, when the Israelis invaded, Lebanon ceased to be a country, a state as we think of one. Today, the Israelis withdrew, yet more men is celebrated. But behind them, in sharp contrast, they're leaving a Lebanon now on the road to complete disintegration. As of this morning, more than 50,000 Christians were trapped here in the mountain town of Jezin, in the heart of southern Lebanon. For centuries they've lived in this region. Now they've been driven out of their villages at gunpoint. Their homes have been ransacked. Tonight, with little food and water, they're under siege. To understand why is to understand that the Christians were once the allies of Israel, and that with the Israelis going, they're paying the price. The Muslim militias responsible have acted together, they've advanced together, and for this they've had the support of the Syrians, Israel's main enemy in the Middle East. The Syrians have provided Russian-made tanks for the Muslims to attack Christian strongholds these past few days. Little mercy has been shown. The obvious intent is to destroy any opposition amongst the Christians and to force the civilian population south towards Israel, as is now happening. Much as they're leaving, the Israelis bear a good deal of responsibility for what's happened, because until now they'd encouraged and supplied the Christians to fight the Muslims. Now the Israelis have virtually the entire Christian population of the region seeking refuge with them as they pull out. All of them in desperate need of food, water and medicine. The humanitarian need of these people is one thing. The Israelis are promising help. Political considerations quite another, though. David Smith, ITN, Israel.
In New York, 4 armed men have staged what could be the world's biggest ever cash robbery. Some reports said they got away with up to $50 million, that's £41 million, from the Wells Fargo vaults. The men wearing ski masks used sledgehammers to break through from an adjoining building. When the guards arrived, they were overpowered and handcuffed to a forklift truck. The money was transferred from the safe to a company truck, which was later found abandoned. An SAS colonel has pleaded guilty to keeping 150 documents, some relating to operations against the IRA, at his home in Tunbridge Wells. Colonel Richard Lee was away serving as a military attaché in Oman when they were found. He's charged under the Official Secrets Act. An inquiry has begun into how 4-year-old Jasmine Beckford died in council care after violent beatings from her stepfather. The inquiry panel's own counsel said the whole weight of the welfare state had failed to prevent Jasmine's death. The inquiry heard that the social worker on the case, Miss Gun Wallstrom, only saw Jasmine once in the last 10 months of her life. A forensic scientist has told an inquest how convicted murderer James Bakery, who died after an armed siege last month, convinced him he'd rather die than go back to jail. The jury in London has been watching an ITN video of the last moments of the siege.
The psychiatrist who helped police at the scene of the siege told the inquest jury that Bakery was suffering from a psychopathic personality disorder and saw himself as the black sheep of his family. During the siege, he refused to speak to any of his family, including one of his sisters, who was in court today, and they refused to help the police. During the final hours of the siege, Bakery told police negotiators he was going to shoot his head and that he was going to come out of the van in a plastic sheet. He sounded despairing and disconsolate and was obsessed with not wanting to go back to the prison he escaped from. A videotape of the final police move against Bakery, made at the time by ITN, was shown to the court. 21 seconds after those gas canisters were fired, Bakery shot himself. The police told the court they decided to act because the longer the siege went on, the more likely Bakery was to become irrational or difficult to predict. The inquest will continue tomorrow. David Chater, ITN, at Westminster Coroner's Court.
Buckingham Palace has refused to comment on reports that the Queen stopped Prince Charles attending a papal mass during the royal visit to the Vatican. Sources in the Vatican say the Archbishop of Canterbury had approached the Pope and he'd agreed to such a mass, but it was left out of the Prince and Princess's final schedule.
The official royal line here is that attending a mass in the Pope's private chapel was on the cards, but it's firmly denied that the Queen vetoed it. However, the idea of the future head of the Church of England going to a Roman mass would certainly be embarrassing to the Queen, and that's why it was called off. But the visit to the Vatican went ahead in some splendor as the slow-paced royal procession made its way to the Pope's study. Bishop Jacques Martin, head of the papal household, led the Prince of Wales past the Swiss guards. Behind came the princess in a black calf-length dress designed by Catherine Walker. She had a veil of black lace but kept it off her face throughout the visit. She was extremely nervous. She'd confessed earlier to being apprehensive about today, understandably awed by the occasion.
There's the Prince of Wales.
The Pope came to the outer door of his study to greet his visitors. There was a handshake from the Prince and a small curtsy from the Princess. Then they went into the private audience, which lasted 30 minutes, a little longer than scheduled. Afterwards, the formal photographs were taken. As always, it was a slightly self-conscious occasion, everyone aware of the underlying politics. They went back to the Vatican this afternoon, touring the sites of the Basilica of St. Peter's, including the tomb of St. Peter himself. And moments like these, when art replaced the politics of religion, was something of a relief. Anthony Carthew, ITN, at the Vatican.
16 people have now died from flu in hospitals in Stafford, and more than 60 between the ages of 50 and 70 are being treated. 11 of the victims died in Stafford District Hospital and 5 at Kingsmead Hospital. A health authority spokesman said it appeared to be a form of flu which turned into pneumonia. Nurses have been giving up their annual leave and days off to help fight the illness. The Space Shuttle Challenger blasted off a short time ago, just 10 days after its sister ship Discovery returned to Earth. It's the fastest turnaround between shuttle missions so far, and NASA hope there will now be a shuttle flight a month for the rest of the year. For the first time, monkeys and men are travelling together. With the 7 astronauts, there'll be a menagerie of 2 monkeys and 24 rats. Experiments will be carried out in the SPACELAB built by the European Space Agency, the second time it's been used. And the countdown went smoothly.
8, 7, go for main engine start. 6, we have main engine start, all 3 engines up and running. 3, 2, 1, 0. SRB ignition, and Challenger in SPACELAB 3 is airborne and has cleared the tower.
Tower clear.
Houston now controlling, roll program initiated. Roger, roll, Challenger.
A 9-year-old girl who was given a new heart only 10 weeks ago has gone back to school saying she feels really brilliant. Pamela Owen from Fareham in Hampshire could hardly walk before her operation at Papworth, but today she almost skipped into the schoolyard, obviously delighted to be back with her friends. She's even hoping to join in games lessons soon.
How difficult was it before you had your operation for you?
I couldn't do any sports, and felt quite ill.
Yes. You were tired all the time? Yes. And how about now?
I feel brilliant.
Viewers in the TVS region can see more of Pamela in Coast to Coast after this programme. Save the Children Fund has raised almost £23 million for famine relief in Ethiopia and the Sudan. Today, Princess Anne, president of the fund, was in London to launch Save the Children Fund Week and thank some of the people who helped to raise the money. The fund is responsible for dozens of projects throughout the world. One of the biggest is the nutrition unit in Dhaka, capital of Bangladesh, which looks after 60,000 starving children a year.
Each week, 1,000 patients visit the Save the Children Fund nutrition unit at Dhaka. But the little girl arriving with her mother at the outpatients clinic is considered to be a VIP. Fulbanu today is a bright, healthy 5-year-old. It's hard to believe, just 2 years ago, she was the starving picture of skin and bone who captured the heart of the Queen when she visited the unit during the royal tour of Bangladesh and India. The near-miraculous transformation took months of devoted medical care, work that continues today.
This is the ward where Fulbanu met the Queen and was nursed back to health. Today, like then, every single cot is full of children receiving desperately needed help.
Most of these babies, like Fulbanu, will be saved. Others brought in too late will lose their battle for life. In most cases, children have starved because the monsoon rains have washed away their families' crops. But blindness caused by vitamin deficiency is another common problem. To avoid such tragedies, Fulbanu's mother, Rabea, has joined a group of young mothers who are being taught that pumpkin, cheap to buy but rich in vitamin A, can save their children from blindness. Of course, for Fulbanu, the trip to the city and the Save the Children unit, where she's always a centre of attraction, is just a big adventure. But the information her mother and all the other mothers will take back to their villages tonight could save thousands of lives. Paul Davis, ITN, Dhaka.
This evening's main story again. The government has ordered a major shake-up in the health service to improve the screening of women for cervical cancer. And finally, 27 aircraft swept over Holland today to recreate a life-saving World War II airlift. Just before VE Day, Allied air crews, with Germany's permission, dropped food to the starving Dutch in Operation Manna.
The war was all but over. Germany was on the point of surrender, but tens of thousands of Dutch children were on the point of death from starvation. These were the innocent victims, and a low priority for a German army that was having trouble feeding itself. And so Operation Manna, Food from Heaven, was staged. Aircraft from Britain and America, Australia and New Zealand, Canada and Poland. Hundreds of tons of life-saving food for thousands of Dutch lives that were saved. The Dutch have never forgotten. They are this week feting 200 of the Allied airmen who were involved to help remember those days of deliverance. Today, a reconstruction of Operation Manna following the same route as the first. Planes old and new from the Allied air forces, this time dropping sweets for today's Dutch children. And at the rear, one of the planes involved in 1945, the Lancaster, escorted as ever by the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The Dutch wartime generation heard and saw again the once familiar planes and told today's children of the comfort they'd once brought. In Holland, where the spirit of remembrance is still very strong, it's estimated that 5 million people took to the streets today to gaze skyward and say thank you. Jeremy Hands, ITN, aboard Lancaster, City of Lincoln.
Next from ITN, Channel 4 News, and they go live to Washington for an interview with President Reagan as he heads to Europe for the Economic Summit.
Tonight, before he leaves, I and 5 journalists from the other summit nations will be talking to him here at the White House. We shall be transmitting the interview live by satellite on Channel 4 News at 7. We hope you'll join us.
And that's the news so far tonight. Good night. The Space Shuttle Challenger blasted off a short time ago, just 10 days after its sister ship Discovery returned to Earth. It's the fastest turnaround between shuttle missions so far, and NASA hope there will now be a shuttle flight a month for the rest of the year. For the first time, monkeys and men are travelling together. With the 7 astronauts, there'll be a menagerie of 2 monkeys and 24 rats. Experiments will be carried out in the SPACELAB built by the European Space Agency, the second time it's been used. And the countdown went smoothly.
8, 7, go for main engine start. 6, we have main engine start, all 3 engines up and running. 3, 2, 1, 0. SRB ignition, and Challenger in SPACELAB 3 is airborne and has cleared the tower.
Tower clear. Houston now controlling, roll program initiated. Roger, roll, Challenger.
Shuttle Challenger is just about to launch 2 satellites, 5 hours after its takeoff from Cape Canaveral. It's only 10 days since the other shuttle, Discovery, returned from space, the shortest gap yet between missions.
3, 2, 1, 0. SRB ignition, and Challenger in SPACELAB 3 is airborne and has cleared the tower.
The NASA Space Agency hopes to launch 1 shuttle every month this year. The 7 astronauts have with them a pair of monkeys and 24 rats. They'll be studying the animals' behavior and their feeding habits.
Has struck a problem on its first day in orbit. A small satellite stayed in a canister in the cargo bay, despite 3 attempts to launch it. The 7-man crew will also be carrying out experiments in the European-built SPACELAB. They'll be investigating the effects of weightlessness on animals. Vietnam has to
research. It carried 7 men, 2 squirrel monkeys, and 24 rats. It was only 17 days since the last shuttle, Discovery, landed, making this the shortest ever turnaround between missions.
10, 9, 8, 7, go for main engine start. 6, we have main engine start, all 3 engines up and running. 3, 2, 1, ignition, and Challenger in SPACELAB 3 is airborne and has cleared the tower.
The launch of Challenger went perfectly, but later in the flight there were problems with the plumbing and with communications with NASA at Houston.
We're going to have some problems if we run into anything like this on this series of cases.
We also see that the experiment computer looks no-go to us.
Go ahead, Challenger. That processor used to control operations.
We're a little concerned about falling too far behind.
Pop Pro is 25.1, 34.0, 26.2, 35.1.
Roger, Bob. That was a teleprinter message 17.
That we get it with the...
Challenger is due back home tomorrow after completing many scientific experiments.
and despite a computer fault, successfully pulled out of orbit to begin the long descent to Earth. Challenger is landing at the Edwards Air Force Base to avoid the kind of crosswinds that caused a lock break and a blown-out tyre when the shuttle Discovery came down in Florida a fortnight ago.
Just about now. And in fact, we're getting these pictures live from Edwards Air Force Base. Now there she comes, the end of a trip for the 7 astronauts and the small menagerie of rats and monkeys that they took with them. And in spite of early technical problems, the astronauts managed to complete nearly all the planned scientific experiments, and NASA says the flight's been an outstanding success.
Touchdown on main gear.
Smooth landing there for Challenger pilot Fred Gregory. Well now, 2,700 runners from all over the United Kingdom
did their latest mission with a perfect landing in California. They brought their 100-ton spacecraft safely back to Earth at Edwards Air Force Base a week after blasting off from Cape Canaveral. Challenger, with its cargo of 2 monkeys and 24 rats, was diverted from Florida to avoid the kind of crosswinds that caused a blown-out tyre when its sister ship Discovery landed there a fortnight ago.
Took part in the evacuation, returned to Dunkirk for the ceremony. Mike Mackay was there.
Ex-gunner Steve Mongan was 19 when he last stood here, relieved to see the remarkable fleet sent to rescue British and French troops. Separated from his unit, he had made his way to Dunkirk, where a destroyer was bombed and sank beneath him. Joined today by his 2 sons and grandsons, Mr. Mongan recalled the scene as he was eventually evacuated in a cross-channel ferry.
I can't remember the name of the little boat, but I remember a little boat that was about 3 inches above the water when all the men got on. He was probably carrying 100 men when he should have been carrying 12. And we watched them go out. Mind, the little ships were escorted by tugs or minesweepers or whatever it was, who also carried men.
At sea, just off Dunkirk, a memorial service led by HMS Active and her crew. A French frigate was also on hand. The laying of a wreath was performed from a Wessex helicopter from RAF Manston, with a winchman being lowered towards a marker boat while the little ships formed a huge circle. Next, a flypast by a Spitfire and a Hurricane, at the scene where German planes had strafed and bombed the ships, killing and wounding thousands of servicemen. Following in their path, the Red Arrows, the jet age paying tribute to the age of piston engines, their red, white and blue vapour trails mingling the colours of both Britain and France.
A revolutionary British spacecraft was officially unveiled in model form at the Paris Air Show today, 9 months after ITN revealed the secret plans for it. Developed by British Aerospace, the spacecraft is being designed to use a conventional runway like a normal plane, hence its name, HOTOL, which stands for Horizontal Takeoff and Landing.
So far, the only flying HOTOL has done is across the channel in a packing crate. The 9-foot plastic model looks almost lost in the vast number of exhibits at the Paris Air Show. But by the end of the century, this British invention could virtually monopolise the multi-million-pound business of putting satellites into orbit. It'll be the first completely reusable spacecraft designed to take off and land on a conventional runway, using a revolutionary new design of rocket engine which breathes the oxygen from the air to fire its propellant. It could launch satellites at a fraction of the present costs.
Well, I think that it's important that the world has a means of getting satellites into orbit without using large fireworks which have to be expended after every launch and fall back in the sea or on somebody's head somewhere.
Are you sure it will be a real winner in the satellite market?
That's right. I mean, I think that it would put everything else out of business if it came off.
Details of the rocket engine being developed by Rolls-Royce have been kept secret on the insistence of the Ministry of Defence. That has stalled international cooperative efforts to develop the project. Other countries, though, are pushing ahead more energetically into the satellite market. France is developing a new version of their European launcher, Ariane. It will carry a manned vehicle called Hermes, a sort of mini shuttle. But they admit the designs are based on old-fashioned technology, and the project has run into problems. The problems with the American space shuttle when it comes to launching satellites have been well publicized, but it's still taking the lion's share of the market. The Chinese too have developed a highly successful satellite program, so can anything more be done to get Britain's HOTOL off the ground?
Well, I think it looks very interesting, and the first thing to do, as I said in Rome in January, is to make certain that we're satisfied it's going to work. And if it looks as though it will, then it'd be worth taking him further.
Industrialists are worried that this might be yet another bright British idea which fails through lack of funding or government backing. If it does, the Americans are already on the sidelines and waiting to step in. David Chater, News at 10 at the...
...by the Russian spacecraft Vega 1 have been received on Earth. The international mission is being tracked in Britain and all around the world. A second Russian spacecraft, Vega 2, will repeat the experiments in a few days' time. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reports.
It's taken 6 months for Vega 1 to reach Venus. Last weekend it passed within 23,000 miles of the planet and dropped 2 sets of scientific instruments. The first, suspended from a 10-foot helium balloon, drifted down through the storms of the upper atmosphere. For the last 2 days it's been buffeted about 35 miles above the surface in the clouds of sulfuric acid which cover the planet. Its movements have been tracked from here on Earth 67 million miles away. A short while ago it passed into the sunny side of Venus. Scientists expect it will burst in the heat. The other probe descended to the surface of Venus through blistering temperatures and crushing pressures. Early probes didn't survive more than a few minutes on the ground. This one is designed to send back more information about the surface of the planet. Venus is similar in size to the Earth, but nearer the Sun. Its searing temperatures are thought to be the result of what's called the runaway greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere traps the Sun's heat, making life as we know it impossible.
The Russians have very much made Venus their own planet, in the same way, I suspect, as the Americans have made Mars their own planet. The Russians have actually managed to develop a technology which has enabled them to land probes on the surface of Venus. And that's no mean feat, because Venus is a very inhospitable place.
Scientists hope that by studying the atmosphere of Venus, they'll learn more about how the Earth's atmosphere is kept in balance, enabling life to flourish here.
And that was the 6 o'clock news on Wednesday, the 12th of June, the day on which Sir Kenneth Newman talked of the problems of modern policing. He said criminals today are fit and fast. We must learn to be 5 yards faster and 5 pounds fitter. The Spanish artist Salvador Dali said as his country joined the EEC, "It's a paradox to me. It's Europe which should be entering Spain." And Jane Torval and Christopher Dean spoke of their life on ice together. She said, "We are still just good friends, but we miss each other very much when we're apart." That's it from us. Back tomorrow. Good night.